At the end of the day, if you are being invaded by Russia and they are invading you with tanks, with surface-to-surface missiles, with armored vehicles, you have to be able to defend yourself. Defend yourselves being able to fight against those who have invaded you. So whatever defensive weapons the Ukrainian government might ask the West for that are in the context of defensive nature is something that I would support now.
Well, that was Senator Robert Menendez, chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who says that, in fact, it's not just the rebels alone who are invading eastern Ukraine, that, in fact, it is Russia. And what we've heard over the past recent days is the fact that Ukraine is losing yet another city, this time Mariupol, to the rebel and Russian forces. Joining us to talk about the latest is Christian Leuprecht, who is a Queen's University professor. Thank you for joining us, Christian.
Good afternoon.
Now, this is the latest news, of course, that is concerning that yet another city has been lost to Ukraine, Mariupol, with clear evidence that not only anti-Ukrainian rebels are winning the battle, perhaps, but also the fact that Russia, there have been increasing reports that Russia is sending in its troops and its jets and its tanks. What are the latest? What is the latest?
Well, certainly it suggests that there is at least a high degree of cooperation. These don't strike me as your average sort of rebel forces that just kind of take up arms. They appear to be highly disciplined. They appear to have a very clear plan. They are very strategic, and they appear to have all the necessary logistical and intelligence support to carry out what seem to be fairly effective operations on the ground in fairly short order. So this is clearly a coordinated effort. At the same time, it does not appear that this is sort of a mass invasion and that Russia is kind of careful about how it plays its cards. And so what it suggests is that what Moscow is trying to signal here is that they are certainly in charge of the situation on the ground, and they can control and change the situation on the ground at a moment's notice. And this is, I think, very much an effort to force the Ukrainian government, on the one hand, to pare back its own operation, and on the other hand, to force the Ukrainian government to the negotiating table so that Moscow can exert its leverage and achieve the outcomes that it is intending for the region.
Now, in terms of Ukraine paring back its operation, there are reports that Ukraine has limited resources, military resources, in comparison to what we're seeing from rebels and Russia. Do you know the difference in terms of the number of troops, in terms of the tanks, as well as the weapons and the guns and missiles that the rebels and Russia have?
So we have a very good idea of what the Ukrainian military looks like, because NATO has, of course, for many years maintained two offices in Kiev, one that does NATO outreach and public education with regards to NATO, and the other one being a liaison office that sort of helps to bring the Ukrainian forces somewhat up to speed and integrate them into some of the training and some of the civil military relations courses within that NATO runs for the Partnership for Peace members and also for other countries such as Georgia. And I think this is precisely what is making people in Brussels quite worried, precisely because they have a good understanding of what the Ukrainians are and are not capable of, and they, I think, know full well that the Ukrainian military is, to put it charitably, perhaps not in the best state, which is also, of course, why the Ukrainians persistently keep asking for support that is not forthcoming in the measure that Ukraine might like. But I think NATO knows that given the shape the Ukrainian military is in, if NATO were going to provide support, it would have to be substantial amounts of support. And I think NATO is quite reticent to do that, precisely because it doesn't want to escalate the situation with Russia any more than necessary, politically, economically, the media campaign and media war that's underway, and, of course, the ground offensive.
Now, Ukraine, of course, is a country that fought for a long time for its own freedom, and now that freedom is under threat because of the expanding reach of Russia, and certainly by these anti-Ukrainian rebels. After the break, we're going to get back to this because I want your thoughts on what we can expect this week as well as in coming up in weeks. We'll be back after the break. Well, we're talking about the increasing tensions and activity in eastern Ukraine by anti-Ukrainian rebels, as well as reports that there are more Russian troops as well as tanks that are now invading, if you will, into eastern Ukraine. And as you'll see on the map, Mariupol has been the latest city, a city about the size of Hamilton, Ontario, that in fact has been invaded. Ukraine armed forces indicates that it is hoping to maintain that city, but there's a big question mark over that. Joining us is Christian Leuprecht, who is a Queen's University professor who is helping us to dissect this latest crisis. Now, Christian, I wanted to ask you about the fact that at NATO this week, the Ukraine representatives, of course, will be asking NATO leaders for additional support, including Canada. What are the chances that there's going to be an announcement this week of any level of support from these NATO leaders?
Well, I think the sort of level of support that might possibly be forthcoming might be some more intelligence support. And there's also at the NATO summit an effort underway to effectively put together a pot of money to help the Ukrainians with training. But there's no actual armed support forthcoming. The Germans have made that very clear. The Americans have made it clear that they're not about to send arms. And this is precisely, I think, not to provoke and make the situation any more difficult than it already is. Now, if you look, of course, at the map that you just showed, you can see that one of the reasons the Russians are engaging in this effort is not only to detract from the efforts of the Ukrainian forces near Donetsk and Luhansk, but you can also see that Russia's had great difficulty resupplying the Crimea Peninsula through the ferry link that exists. The backup times for trucks are up to 3 days wait to get across. And so this is likely an effort by the Russians to establish a land connection between Crimea and Russia. At the same time, we have the negotiations in Minsk that seem to suggest that Russia may be willing to settle for something other than just a complete independence of that region. And we saw a rather befuddled sort of response from the Russian Foreign Ministry after Vladimir Putin last week basically called for this new establishment of New Russia, and the Russian Foreign Ministry then clarified that as saying that there's a whole number of autonomous regional sort of options that are on the table here. So it seems to be that there's also some wrangling within the Russian administration as to what exactly the strategic objectives here should be. And I think this suggests that there's perhaps some tension here between the personal ambitions and legacy of Vladimir Putin as a president and the broader strategic sort of objectives that Russia may be trying to achieve in the medium and long term, and that these perhaps have not been reconciled within the Putin administration itself.
Yeah, and this theory that there could be a domino effect of Russia wanting to expand its reach into other countries, for example, the Baltic states, is this something that is concerning to countries like Germany? Because we've heard from Chancellor Angela Merkel of late indicating that business interests, for example, trade, is now secondary to the concerns over introducing stability in the region.
So absolutely, and for instance, we saw the Canadians just in the last couple of days taking over the role, the primary role for sort of the air missions that are being flown over the Baltic states in terms of defense, because the Baltic states don't have an air force in and of themselves to fly that mission. That has been a long-time promise by NATO to them, and we've seen also this effort by NATO to step up forward sort of, if you want, quasi-command centers from which they could coordinate any response if there were a threat to eastern border Russian neighbors, so those are in the Baltic states and Poland and down to Romania, in terms of those efforts staffed by perhaps up to 300 individuals. But there's no sort of, I think, immediate indication that Russia is looking to start a confrontation with NATO, and Russia understands full well that I think this would also not be in Russian interest. Plus, what Russia is trying to achieve here, it does not need or want a confrontation with NATO. This is really a debate about the future of Ukraine and what place Ukraine will have in terms of the larger Russian sphere of economic, political, defense, and security strategy and influence. And Russia, I think, does not intend to settle that by starting a broader confrontation with NATO, but certainly the new NATO member countries on the eastern edge of NATO are rightly concerned, have been the most vocal and outspoken about the situation, and NATO needs to make good on its assurance to those countries that their sovereignty and security is not threatened by the sort of moves that we see by Russia within the region.
Now, we've heard some pretty blunt calls that trade sanctions are not enough, that to ward off the threat of Russia, and in terms of its invasion mentality, there's going to have to be military action. Do you agree?
Well, there's the famous dictum by Field Marshal Montgomery, do not march on Moscow. And I think everybody within NATO is keeping that in mind, as disturbing as what we see in eastern Ukraine is. The Russians do have certain strategic interests. This is the wealthiest part of Ukraine, part of Ukraine's it's part of the airplane manufacturing industry in that region continues to supply the Russians, and in particular the Russian Air Force. So NATO, I don't think, is going to be looking to start World War III over eastern Ukraine, and the moves in eastern Ukraine, as upsetting as it is to international and regional stability. And so the pushback will be in terms of isolating Russia, and that seems to be having some effect, because ultimately Vladimir Putin needs to rely on the support of the oligarchs, as we've seen over the last 15 years. Any moves that Putin makes that are not coordinated with the oligarchs will shut down very quickly. And we can see by the fall of the Russian ruble, we can see by the decline of the Russian economy, and by the loss of hundreds of billions of dollars in assets on the stock market of Russian companies that are controlled by these oligarchs, that I think the oligarchs are starting to get a little bit nervous about these adventures. And so I think this is an effort to withdraw the support that the oligarchs extend to Putin, and perhaps even to get some sort of a regime change in Moscow as the medium-term strategy for NATO and Western allies to try to come to a more agreeable resolution over the status of Eastern and Southeastern Ukraine.
Yeah, certainly this is a big week as these world leaders will meet in Wales, and we'll certainly be watching in all week. Thank you very much, Christian Leuprecht, Queen's University professor.